NTV television network presents. The Other Day, Current Era, 1966. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. You're watching The Other Day, 1961 to 1991. Current Era. Events, people, and occurrences which defined a lifestyle. Things that we can't imagine ourselves without, let alone comprehend. In today's episode, we're covering 1966, land development, March 8th declared a holiday, the 23rd Communist Party Congress, an earthquake in Tashkent, China's Cultural Revolution, the amber fashion trend, the crackdown on hooliganism, and 13 Chairs Pub. Commenting we have screenwriter and actress Renata Litvinova and political expert Sergei Karaganov. In 1966, the Soviet Union's Luna 9 robotic spacecraft became the first to make a soft landing on the surface of the moon. Soon after that, the Luna 10 station, launched 2 months later, became the moon's first artificial satellite. This opened up lunar space, the next step in terms of distance after a low orbit around the Earth. The Luna 9 station is the first to make a soft landing on the moon, the nearest celestial body to us. It took 3.5 days for the Luna 9 to fly to the moon, with it landing in the ocean of storms. From there, the Luna 9 started sending radio signals and transmitting images of the moon's surface in different lighting conditions, which allowed for reconstructing a lunar panorama and charting the terrain. The Luna 10, being an artificial satellite of the moon, circumnavigated our closest cosmic neighbor 460 times. A long-term land development program is approved. After corn and big chemistry, this was the country's third large-scale agricultural campaign. Dewatering of the northern lands and irrigation in the south were supposed to bring agriculture in line with restructured heavy industry. Vast territories were subject to improvement. The Mizar-Chol and Karshi plains, the territories along the roads next to the North Crimean and Karakum canals, the Kakhovka irrigation system on the Dnieper River, the Chernozem region and western Siberia. 25 million acres of land were dewatered, with another 27 million irrigated. Land development in Russia's substantially reshaped northern provinces amounted to pretty much nothing, though Middle Asian cotton irrigation did turn out to be somewhat effective, and rice production increased by 2.5 times. At the very beginning of the year, a meeting, attended by head of Soviet government Alexei Kosygin, is held between leaders of 2 enemy countries, India and Pakistan. Lal Bahadur Shastri and Ayub Khan flew into Tashkent with the intention of ending the war in Kashmir, which went down in history as the India-Pakistan incident. A peace treaty was signed on January 10th, but on January 11th, while in Tashkent, Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri suddenly dies. The casket with his body is carried to the plane by Ayub Khan, the president of Pakistan, which until the preceding day had been at war with India, and USSR's chairman of the Council of Ministers, Alexei Kosygin. Indira Gandhi was appointed as India's new prime minister. That same year, she pays visit to the USSR. The expression "Dear Indira Gandhi" appears. For the next 20 years, the last name Gandhi will be considered the most renowned symbol of India's politics. UNESCO declared that during the 8-year period between 1958 and 1966, the amount of movie theaters in the world had doubled, with them mostly attended by younger folks. The post-war baby boom, together with a sudden and unnatural decline in the elderly population, causes an increase in the proportion of young people living on the planet. And 1966 was when the worldwide cinema boom peaked. And the leader, hands down, was the USSR. On average, each and every Soviet citizen, including infants, went to see a movie 19 times a year. Second place went to the United States at 12 times a year. Meanwhile, in France and Britain, people would on average attend 8 movies a year. In the USSR, the only thing more profitable than cinema was vodka. Soviet Screen magazine was selling an astronomical number of copies, and everybody was going nuts over colored pictures of actors made by the Soviet Bureau of Cinema Propaganda. Andrei Mironov, Tatiana Doronina, Natalia Fateyeva and Zhana Bolotova were hung on walls in dorm rooms, foremen's booths, were placed underneath glass on tables in agencies, school kids would trade posters. Contrary to the rules of show business, the 1960s main star couple, Svetlana Svetlichna and Vladimir Ivashov, would take pictures separately, though everybody in the country knew full well that they were married. In 1966, March 8th, or International Women's Day, is officially recognized as a holiday. The country received yet another holiday which wasn't paired with another day off or being hung over, such as the 2nd of May or the 8th of November. Celebration traditions were established immediately. The ceremonial meeting would always be held at the Bolshoi Theater. Officially, the venue was ranked lower than the Palace of Congresses, but it was cozier after all. An opening word from head of the Moscow Communist Party City Committee Kapitolina Dementyeva. Later on, this role would be assumed by Minister of Culture Yekaterina Furtsova, the only top-ranking female government official. Valentina Tereshkova would become chairwoman of the Soviet Women's Committee. Afterwards, she would be assigned to a different, traditionally female position, chairwoman of the Union of Soviet Friendship Associations. 8th of March celebrations at enterprises, agencies, and schools resembled a sort of ritual, with invariable sets of gifts consisting of a bouquet, a postcard, and a souvenir. Every single outlet from newsletters to central newspapers issued a holiday edition. They began with pretentious tributes which went something like, "For you, my lady," while ending on strange humor about how on March 8th men are the ones doing laundry and cooking food. Out of all gifts, perfume was the most popular. The most valued among domestic perfumes were the ones made by Dzintaris in Riga, Northern Lights from Leningrad, and by the Krasnaya Zarya factory in Moscow. A flower boom had also begun, with the most affordable being mimosa. Carnations were a step up, but they were considered a bit protocol, especially the red ones. People would prefer early tulips, with roses, of course, being the pinnacle of luxury.
March 8th was less of a holiday than it was an occasion when men could express themselves as real men before their women. Present them mimosa, perfume, flowers. People would mockingly say that 364 days in a year belonged to men, while just 1 in 365 belonged to women. The USSR was the only country in the world that declared March 8th a day off. That was sort of a gesture on behalf of a masculine country towards the female population. Even today, many businesswomen despise the 8th of March, stating that loving and considering March 8th a holiday is no more than an act of desperation. But here's my opinion. Just let it be. Let's continue acknowledging March 8th as something of an occasion for men. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev bestows a Gold Star Medal upon Tatar Zhivkov. The first ever agreement on air service was signed between the USSR and the United States. The carriers Pan America and Aeroflot scheduled 2 flights per week between Moscow and New York. The end of yet another transatlantic flight by Aeroflot. It took 9.5 hours to make the flight. Towards the end of the decade, the number of flights would be increased to 6 per week, with destinations including Washington, D.C. Since this was the only direct bridge between the two superpowers, the airway would constantly be used as a means for exercising political will. New York's governor could forbid landing an already arriving Soviet airplane, forcing to divert towards the more liberal Washington. And when Pan Am would cease to operate on that airway, we'd take commensurate measures. In response to martial law in Poland, flights were prohibited for the next 5 years. In 1966, the ice broke, so to speak, in Soviet Circus. Previously an experiment, the Circus on ice started actively touring. Before that we had ballet on ice, but that was pretty common back then. Our ballet wasn't something new.
However, Soviet circus was the first to go out onto the ice, a genre that won't be put on ice. Everybody got a pair of skates. Gymnasts, jugglers, acrobats, eccentrics, bears, and later even a rooster would be put on a pair of skates. An unusual number created by former Durov Animal Theater worker Anatoly Mayorov. A talented and patient animal trainer can put even a bear on skates. The difference between regular and ice circus was like the difference between photography and cinema. Everything that used to be still was set into motion. In tune with Western stereotypes on Russia being a land of snow, the circus on ice was quite busy touring abroad. On April 26, 1966, at 5:23 in the city of Tashkent, the capital of the Uzbek SSR, an earthquake occurred, with a magnitude of 7 to 7.5. Never before or since have severe earthquakes happened in Soviet cities with a population of over 1 million. That day, 8 people died, with 1/3 of the city demolished. The entire country helped with rebuilding Tashkent, RSFSR district, blocks named after Moscow, Leningrad, and every Soviet republic. 48 Russian provinces, territories, and autonomies had their own construction sites. And Tashkent's satellite town Sergeli was erected by military construction workers. Traditional Tashkent housing did somewhat take seismic activity into account. These houses do collapse quite easily, but the rubble most likely wouldn't be enough to kill an adult human being. After that earthquake, the city wasn't so much restored as it was reconstructed. They actually put up a completely different city center. New Tashkent became a sort of hallmark of the Eastern Soviet Union, where they would hold film and other forums for Asian, African, and Latin American countries. Raketa watches made by the Petrodvorets factory were exported to 30 countries all around the world. This calls for a few more nice remarks about Soviet-made watches, especially those made by the Petrodvorets watch factory near Leningrad. The extra slim Raketa model watch was said to be thinner than a pair of 5-kopeck coins. It had a large diameter dial, modern-style slender hour markers, and a thin gold-plated bezel. Raketa was definitely the country's most trendy wristwatch. In 1966, China, under the rule of Mao Zedong, enters its own breaking point and great terror stage known as the Cultural Revolution. Mao declares its beginning in August during a Chinese Communist Party plenary meeting. The main driving force of the Cultural Revolution were student paramilitary squads known as Red Guards. The Chinese Cultural Revolution meant vanquishing the old party staff, city-based intellectuals, and the bourgeoisie middle-classers. Revisionists, privilege, and Western influence were countered with Bolshevist extremism, true proletarian culture, and labor re-education in factory collectives and rural communes. In order to free up the Red Guards for revolutionary massacres, for a few years no new students were allowed to apply for university. 22 million Red Guards conducted 4 kinds of purging: political, economic, organizational, and ideological. Repressions affected all but the main cornerstone of Mao's regime, which would be China's People's Liberation Army. The Cultural Revolution conquered both space and time, suppressed a rebellion in Wuhan, where the population had slaughtered all the local Red Guards, while delving into criticizing Politburo member Lin Biao and great philosopher Confucius, who lived prior to the beginning of the current era. China had dropped the Silk Curtain, withdrawing 44 out of their 47 foreign ambassadors, while warning foreign diplomats that in Beijing their safety could not be guaranteed outside of their embassies. China's population of 1 billion people study the works of Chairman Mao, mostly based on quotes from Mao's Little Red Book. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the very best of the Kremlin's liberals put together brochures about Maoism being a threat to humankind. This was their way of criticizing neo-Stalinist tendencies, which were ever the more prevalent in Soviet domestic policy. The Kizhi Pogost Ensemble, located on Kizhi Island in Karelia, or sometimes pronounced as Kizhi, is declared a state historical architectural reserve. This was official recognition of an ever more widespread infatuation with the Russian North, wooden architecture, icons, and spinning wheels. Kizhi was mainly presented as an amazing achievement of Russian craftsmen, who built the Church of the Transfiguration with its 22 domes without using a single nail. The churches were erected by the very same carpenters who made huts and barns, according to the newspapers, which effectively made these wooden churches works of folk art. Valuable wooden buildings were brought over to Kizhi from all of Karelia. The village they put together was dubbed a museum under the sky. The Ukrainian automotive industry conceives a new subcompact class car. The ZAZ 965, or Hunchback Zaporozhets, which people used to poke fun at, was replaced by a new Zaporozhets, designated as the ZAZ 966. The Hunchback ZAZ 965 was the only true people's car of the time, while being no more powerful than a motorcycle. For some reason, people would only give nicknames to the Zaporozhets. The new kid on the block, the ZAZ 966, was called big-eared because of its side air ducts. Just like with the Hunchback before, they produced a version of the big-eared Zaporozhets with manual controls for disabled drivers. 1966 was the year when writers Andrei Sinyavskii and Leonid Daniel were prosecuted. Sinyavskii and Daniel secretly sent their work to the West, where it was published under the aliases Abraham Tertz and Nikolai Arzhak. The KGB figured out who were the true authors hiding behind these aliases and arrested them. Sinyavskii and Daniel were charged under Penal Code Article 70, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. Sinyavskii and Daniel's court hearing, together with the public's reaction, is considered to be the beginning of what would later be called the human rights movement. This was the first arrest that was extensively covered by foreign news outlets. A closed court hearing was no longer possible. Even Izvestia covered the trial. People with special passes would be admitted to the courtroom. Alibi witness testimony was overruled. As for the price of dissidence, Andrei Sinyavskii was sentenced to 7 and Leonid Daniel to 5 years in a maximum security prison. The defendants pled not guilty, while insisting during their final statement on their right to creative freedom and it being unacceptable to press criminal charges for writing works of fiction. The arrest of these two authors caused the first ever human rights protests in Soviet history, where people demanded a transparent trial for Sinyavskii and Daniel, and famously called to honor the Soviet constitution. A genre of written protest was born, and whoever addressed the authorities in this way was labeled as a signatory. That same year, a new article was added to the Penal Code, 190-1, dissemination of knowingly false fabrications that defame the Soviet state and social system, verbal or written criticism of the one-party system, with no alternative decisions on behalf of the parliament, which always votes for, punishable by up to 3 years in prison. Had these shameless thugs been caught back during the notorious 1920s, when people were trialed not based on clearly spelled out articles of the Penal Code, but out of revolutionary legal awareness. Mikhail Shalakhov on Sinyavskii and Daniel during his speech at the 23rd Congress of the Communist Party. These werewolves would have received a very different sentence. But here they are complaining about how severe a punishment they were dealt. I'd also like to address the foreign advocates of these two hacks. Don't be concerned about whether we can preserve criticism. We support and embrace criticism. There has even been some harsh criticism voiced at this very Congress. But slander isn't criticism. Just like mud from a puddle isn't the same thing as paint from an artist's palette. However, the leaders of two superpowers agreed on the need for initiating a dialogue Items made from amber, which is basically ancient resin, become a fashion trend. Democritus thought of amber to be fossilized bobcat urine. In any case, it turned out that the USSR was home to 98% of the world's supply of this affordable crafting material. Amber is considered to be jewelry, though not the kind that highlights one's wealth, but rather displays individuality. Amber requires almost no machining, with the unique color and shape of each stone being what makes it so valuable. One could confidently purchase reasonably priced amber sets called Galaxy or Elegy. No two items were exactly the same. As for the pricier commodities, stones with ancient flies trapped inside were quite sought after. Those would be used to make predators' rings. The media would extensively cover protest rallies occurring in Japanese coastal towns. The locals were protesting against American military vessels entering their ports. The most often cited example was of Yokosuko port, where an American spook submarine tried to dock. The Japanese are chanting, "Yankees, go home!" It's important to understand that the people were against turning the islands of Japan into the United States' unsinkable aircraft carrier. Yokosuka port, with its protest against American militarism, continued the tradition of us being introduced to words sounding profane to the Russian ear. Before Yokosuka, there was President Nasser, the Chinese Hong Weibings, then we got unlucky with the last name of Bulgaria's first cosmonaut, Kakanov, who would instead be called Ivanov. Then there was that town in former Yugoslavia, the name of which would later be altered. It was simply called Žepa. Back then, Nikita Sergeyevich was first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. (1966) was the year of the 23rd Congress of the Communist Party. Among other things, it resulted in a few vital structural revisions. Around 5,000 delegates representing a 12 million-plus army of communists have gathered in the Palace of Congresses at the Kremlin in order to summarize what had already been achieved and discuss the next 5-year plan. The Central Committee Presidium was reverted back to the Politburo. Central Committee First Secretary was now called General Secretary, just like Stalin. The 70-year age restriction for persons holding a top-level government position, which was implemented right after Khrushchev's resignation, is lifted. That same year, General Secretary Brezhnev will receive his first Hero of the Soviet Union Award in honor of his 60th birthday. In 1966, Sever magazine publishes a tale by Vasily Belov called Business as Usual. Village fiction began to blossom, it being both a literary and social phenomenon. In regards to literature, most people consider Solzhenitsyn's Matrona's Yard to be what set village fiction into motion, while in the public's mind, the predecessors of villager writers were considered to be radical Slavophiles. Among the classics of village fiction, we have Fyodor Abramov, Viktor Astafyev, Valentin Rasputin, Vasily Belov. Their essentially anti-Soviet books revealed that there was an official side of life, and on the other hand a human side, with the two having nothing in common, and doomed to never converge. The sunny and fertile Kuban is replaced by remote northern and Siberian forests, and a lingering distaste for the collective farm system. Village fiction in its entirety was written from the viewpoint of the kulak class. You have no choice but to believe in Russia's special future, to which Europe is completely oblivious, given how special of a past we've had. Here's a fragment from a TV adaptation of Vasily Belov's Carpenter's Tales. How's your cow? Did it give birth yet? After Mardi Gras it will. It just ain't pregnant, man. I'm telling you, man, it ain't pregnant. What do you mean it ain't pregnant? My old lady tells me that it's grown a big udder and a belly. Who cares what your old lady said? Maybe she wasn't looking closely enough. I'm pretty sure my cow is pregnant. When was the last time it was outside? In November? Go ahead and count how many months have gone by. Your cow ain't pregnant, my friend. So much for your milk. Mark my words, it's pregnant. Thanks to village fiction, a viable alternative to communist party truth appeared in the form of men's truth. Men's truth as in village truth, with the city being the absolute embodiment of evil. The life of cities and the entire country allegedly relied on the village. This was a markedly Russian truth, which didn't like foreigners and strangers. This was also a serious and harsh truth, with literally everybody else having it better and easier than the Russian villagers. It was also strictly conservative, with the ideal life lost somewhere in the past, the present looking bleak, and the future completely unpromising, with its soul-hollowing technological innovations. USSR Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev meets with President Gamal Abdel Nasser. In 1966, flight testing begins of a new airplane called the Yak-40, a jet-powered bus with 24 seats. This is the Yak-40, a small jet-powered aircraft that'll be used for air travel at a distance of under 2,000 kilometers. This was the first time such an elegant machine was used for close-range domestic flights. Jet-powered air travel now became just as much a local as it was a long-distance affair. Yak-40s were first used for flying between Moscow and Kostroma. In 1966, France withdrew from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That same year, France's President Charles de Gaulle pays visit to the Soviet Union. These two events laid the foundation for special political relations between the USSR and the French Republic. Arriving to Moscow on an official visit is President of the French Republic, General Charles de Gaulle. We already had other special relations before that. Even prior to de Gaulle's visit and given the extremely limited exposure to everything Western during that period, the USSR would still frequently organize French culture fairs. Aside from Moscow, de Gaulle visits Leningrad, Kiev, Volgograd, Novosibirsk, the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and the Taman Division. De Gaulle was given a warm welcome, considering that everyone knew him to be one of the leaders of the anti-Hitler alliance. People were especially thrilled with the French leader's habit of ending every speech with a phrase uttered in Russian. Long live the friendship between Russia and France. President de Gaulle had his own very good reasons for his unprecedented visit to Moscow, as well as for his withdrawal from NATO. Since the beginning of the 60s, the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal had been constantly growing, which led him to realize that he could no longer rely on the political guarantees provided to him by the United States. France had to find a different way to protect its own strategic and political interests. It's also worth noting that, while being a member of the alliance, de Gaulle would always try to play it as a somewhat independent member of NATO. This allowed him to maximize France's political might, given a situation when the country had a fairly weak economy. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had a few good reasons of its own. First of all, this was a pretty obvious way to sow discord amidst the imperialist bloc. Second of all, this began a de-escalation, which the Soviet Union was calling for. Meanwhile, the Soviet intelligentsia simply wanted to take another glimpse at France and its culture, which they loved and worshipped. In 1966, a decree was passed on stricter penalties for hooliganism. Everyday life, especially after the war, was quite grim. People didn't tend to stand on ceremony. So the USSR after the war was almost completely awash in hooliganism. The best way to win over a girl was to protect her from a hooligan. A decree issued by the Central Committee Presidium declared that hooliganism was increasingly less acceptable during a period of widespread construction of communism. Minor hooliganism, which included swearing in public places or offensively harassing fellow citizens, was separated from just hooliganism, or severe disorderly conduct, and malicious hooliganism, when those same actions would be committed with extreme cynicism and audacity. Penalties varied from a 10 to 15-day arrest to 3 to 7 years in prison. While the hunters were loading their rifles, people become obsessed with automation. Automatic equipment moved from the production line and into people's everyday lives. Progress. That's the name of this new store located in Moscow. Here, cashiers have been replaced with machines. The first fully automated shop. Here we can see the machines being prepared for operation. It would seem as if people would soon be just dropping coins and pushing buttons. Each machine accepts coins of any nominal value. At the same time, the first automated cash registers appear at railway stations. Sparkling water vending machines would replace elderly women who used to sell soda out on the streets. And the movie Operation Y had an entire scene dedicated to a sparkling water machine. Did you pass your test? In 1966, Central Television airs a new show called Good Evening, which is immediately renamed to 13 Chairs Pub. Actors from the Moscow Satire Theater call each other Pan and Pani. It all appears to be taking place in Poland, and the jokes used tend to be from other socialist countries. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Oh my goodness. Will you just look at the products they make nowadays? I used to look so much better in the older mirrors. All the men were head over heels for me. 13 Chairs Pub was a trendsetter and the Soviet Union's first soap opera. The Polish Mrs. is wearing some lovely attire, and looking at her, thousands of women from Brest to Nakhodka are coming up with their own evening dress ideas. Jokes about Poland are decidedly safer, while jokes aimed our way are usually avoided. It's either do or die, and you're better off if you do. Can you even imagine, Pan Professor? Yesterday, my 3-year-old son took my latest poem about rabbits and tore it to shreds. Oh, really? So he knows how to read? Pani Zosya, tell me please, are you sure that this fish is fresh? No idea. I've only been working here for a week. Actors would more or less consistently lip-sync, and Pan host would tactfully refrain from translating while the songs were performed, giving the viewers at home a chance to record them on tape. So we've just covered the year 1966 in our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, current era. After that, we have 1967. Among other things, that was the year of the Six-Day War in the Middle East, Andropov running the KGB, the Greek military junta, 50 years since the October Revolution, a 5-day work week, statistical data comparing the current year to 1913, Krimplin, the film Kidnapping Caucasian Style, and instead of 3 years of compulsory military service, just 2. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.